moment I saw him in that bar in Paris, my stomach dropped. It wasn't just a feeling of familiarity. It was the kind of recognition that hits you like cold water. My brain knew his face before I could even remember where I had seen it. And the second our eyes locked, I understood something I wish I had never figured out. That man had been connected to my family for years. At the time, I was 22 years old and had just graduated from college. My family had lived in the same house for almost my entire life. It was a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where nothing ever really happened. Kids rode bikes in the street. People walked their dogs every evening. Most of the houses looked almost identical. Our home was a 3-story place that my parents bought when I was very young. The layout of the house is important for this story. My bedroom was on the 2nd floor, and my window faced directly toward the street. Above me, on the 3rd floor, my dad had a small home office. That room also had a single window facing the street. For most of my childhood, nothing about that setup seemed unusual. But looking back now, I think those windows might have been the reason someone started watching us. The first strange thing happened when I was still in middle school. I don't remember my exact age, but I know I was probably around 12. One weekend morning, I was heading downstairs for breakfast when I heard my parents talking in the kitchen. Their voices were low, but my dad sounded worried. I only caught a few pieces of what he said. He mentioned that something had happened again. That word stuck with me. Again. When I walked into the kitchen, both of them immediately stopped talking. I asked what they were discussing, but my mom brushed it off and told me it was nothing important. It wasn't until a few days later that my older brother told me what had actually happened. My dad is a lawyer, and when he has a big case, he often works late into the night at home. That night, he had been in his office working past midnight. At some point, while he was typing, he glanced out the window and noticed a large SUV slowly moving down the street. He described it as almost crawling. Not driving slowly like someone looking for an address. It was slower than that. More like the car was barely moving at all. At first, he ignored it. Cars occasionally passed through the neighborhood late at night. But a minute later, the same vehicle came back down the street from the opposite direction. That was when my dad started paying attention. The SUV rolled to a stop directly across the street from our house, and then it just sat there. For several minutes, my dad watched the car through the window, expecting someone to get out or drive away. Nothing happened. The vehicle stayed parked with its lights off. Eventually, my dad returned to his work, but every few minutes, he looked back outside to check if the car was still there. Hours passed. Around 2 in the morning, he finally fell asleep at his desk. When he woke up around 5:30, the car was still parked in the exact same spot. He said the sight of it instantly made his heart race. For a moment, he actually wondered if he had dreamed the whole thing. But there it was. Sometime shortly before sunrise, the SUV finally drove away. My dad tried to convince himself it was probably someone who had fallen asleep in their car. Still, the whole situation left him uneasy. He later admitted that it wasn't the first time he had seen vehicles slowly driving through the neighborhood late at night, but it was definitely the strangest. For several years after that, nothing else happened. At least, nothing that we noticed. Then when I was 15, something happened that made me start paying attention. At that time, I had gotten really into making music. I spent hours in my room late at night experimenting with different beats on my computer. One night around midnight, I was sitting at my desk with headphones on when something outside my window caught my eye. At first, it looked like a quick flash of light. I paused my music and looked outside. 3 cars were moving slowly down the street. That by itself wasn't unusual. What made my stomach tighten was the way the people inside the cars were behaving. Someone in the first vehicle was shining a flashlight at the houses. The beam moved slowly from one home to the next, scanning windows and yards. I watched the light sweep across my neighbor's house. Then it moved toward mine. Instinctively, I ducked below the window just before the beam reached it. A second later, my entire bedroom ceiling lit up as the flashlight passed over the glass. I stayed completely still. After about 20 seconds, I carefully stood back up and looked outside again. The cars were already nearing the end of the street. All 3 of them turned the corner and disappeared. The next morning, I told my parents what I had seen. Instead of brushing it off, my dad looked seriously concerned. He said it sounded like people were scouting houses. Within a week, he installed a doorbell camera and added several motion lights around the backyard. Life went back to normal after that, or at least it seemed that way. A couple of years later, my dad hired a landscaping company to redo part of the yard behind our house. While trimming some bushes along the fence, one of the workers found something hidden inside the branches. It was a tiny camera. The device was about the size of a car key and clearly designed to be hidden. The battery was completely dead, and when my dad opened it up, he discovered there was no memory card inside. That meant the camera hadn't been storing footage. Instead, it likely streamed video to a nearby receiver while it was active. The realization that someone had planted a hidden camera on our property made my parents furious. But they had no idea when it had been placed there. My dad checked the security footage from the past several months, but nothing suspicious showed up. Eventually, the police were informed, but since the camera was dead and had no identifying information, there wasn't much they could do. After a while, everyone tried to forget about it. But strange things kept happening. Not long after the camera was discovered, our next-door neighbors moved away. Their house sat empty for a few weeks before a young couple moved in. At first, they seemed normal, but over time, I started noticing something odd. Several times late at night, I would see one of them standing at their upstairs window looking toward our yard. They weren't sitting at a desk or doing anything else, just standing there, watching. At first, I assumed they were simply looking outside while on their phone or something. But it kept happening. Sometimes it was early in the morning before sunrise. Other times, it was after midnight. They were always facing our house. One evening, I was walking my dog down the street when I glanced toward their kitchen window. The couple was sitting at the table with a third person. The man with them stood out immediately. He was completely bald and had an extremely muscular build. His eyebrows were thick enough that they almost looked drawn on. The three of them were talking casually. Then suddenly, the woman stood up and pulled the curtains closed. She didn't even look outside. But somehow, I had the strange feeling she knew I was watching. Still, I tried to convince myself it meant nothing. Years passed without any major incidents. Eventually, I graduated college and my family planned a trip to Europe together. A few days into the trip, we were sitting in a small bar in Paris. Everyone was laughing and talking when I looked across the room. That was when I saw him. The bald man from my neighbor's kitchen. He was sitting alone at a booth with a drink in front of him. At first, I told myself it couldn't possibly be the same person, but the more I looked, the more certain I became. Then he looked directly at me. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. It felt like he recognized me too. Suddenly, he stood up, left his drink on the table, and walked out of the bar without paying. I hurried outside to follow him, but by the time I reached the street, he was gone. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, until a few days later. My family was sightseeing when I noticed someone about 50 feet away holding a professional camera. It was him again. He was taking pictures in our direction. I couldn't tell if he was photographing us or the monument behind us. But the moment he saw that I had spotted him, he turned and disappeared around a corner. That was when I finally told my parents everything. My dad believed me immediately. We finished the trip, but none of us felt comfortable for the rest of it. Since coming home, my dad has checked every piece of security footage we have. So far, we haven't found anything new. But I can't shake the feeling that whoever those people are, they've been watching our family for a very long time. And if I'm right, I don't think they're done yet. I stopped trusting my coworkers the night I realized one of them had been sitting inside my car, not near it. Not leaning against it, inside it. The worst part was that I didn't notice right away. At the time, I was working the overnight shift at a small distribution warehouse outside Columbus, Ohio. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid well enough, and the schedule worked for me. From 10 p.m. until about 6 a.m., a small crew of us sorted incoming shipments and prepared packages for delivery trucks that left in the morning. The warehouse itself sat in an industrial park surrounded by empty lots and quiet roads. At night, the place felt isolated. After midnight, there were rarely any cars passing by, and the only sounds came from forklifts, conveyor belts, and the occasional rumble of a truck backing into the loading dock. Most of the overnight crew kept to themselves. There were maybe 10 of us total, but the three people I interacted with the most were a guy named Derek, a woman named Melissa, and another guy named Ron. Derek was the kind of coworker who tried too hard to be friendly. He was always making jokes that weren't funny and asking overly personal questions. Things like where you lived, whether you lived alone, and what you usually did on weekends. Melissa mostly ignored him. Ron, on the other hand, laughed at everything Derek said, even when it didn't make sense. At first, I assumed they were just close friends. But after working there for a couple of weeks, I started noticing things that made me uncomfortable. One night during a break, Derek randomly asked what kind of car I drove. I didn't think much of it and told him it was a dark blue Honda Civic. He nodded, like that information mattered. Then he asked which side of the parking lot I usually parked on. That question caught me off guard. I laughed and said something like, "Why are you planning to steal it?" He smiled, but he didn't laugh. Instead, he just said, "No, just curious." Later that same night, I walked outside to grab something from my car. The parking lot was mostly empty, except for a few employee vehicles parked under dim streetlights. As I approached my car, something felt off. The driver's seat looked slightly reclined. At first, I thought I might have adjusted it earlier and forgotten. But when I opened the door, the smell inside was different. Not bad, just different. Like someone had been sitting there. I checked the glove compartment and center console, but nothing was missing. I eventually convinced myself I was being paranoid. Still, the next night I decided to park in a completely different area of the lot. About halfway through the shift, Derek walked past me while I was sorting packages. He casually said, "You moved your car tonight." The way he said it made my stomach tighten. I hadn't told anyone I was moving it. I asked him how he knew that. He shrugged and said he just noticed when he arrived. Maybe that explanation should have made sense, but it didn't. The parking lot was big, and most people parked wherever they wanted. There was no reason for him to be paying attention to where my car was. After that conversation, I started locking my car every single time I went inside the warehouse. Before that, I sometimes forgot. A few nights later, something happened that made the situation worse. During lunch break, I went outside to eat in my car. It was quiet and warmer than the break room. When I opened the driver's door, a folded piece of paper fell onto the ground. I picked it up. It was a printed map, not a road map, a satellite image from Google Maps. The image showed my neighborhood, and right in the center of the image was my house. There was a red circle drawn around it with a marker. For a few seconds, I just stared at it, trying to process what I was seeing. Then I noticed something else. On the back of the paper, someone had written a short note. It said, "Nice place, quiet street." My heart started pounding. I immediately looked around the parking lot, half expecting someone to be watching me. But the area was empty. I folded the paper and shoved it in my pocket. For the rest of the shift, I couldn't focus on my work. Every time I looked across the warehouse floor, Derek and Ron seemed to be somewhere nearby, watching. At the end of the night, I decided not to drive straight home. Instead, I drove around the city for almost 30 minutes to make sure no one was following me. When I finally got home, I parked in my driveway and checked every corner of the yard before going inside. The next few days were incredibly stressful. I kept replaying everything that had happened in my head. The questions Derek had asked, the seat in my car being moved, the map of my house. Eventually, I decided I needed to test something. On my next shift, I parked in the far corner of the lot where a security camera pointed directly at the row of cars. Before going inside, I placed my phone under the driver's seat with the camera recording. My plan was simple. If someone entered my car again, I would have proof. Around 2 in the morning, I stepped outside to check. Nothing looked different. But when I opened the car door and grabbed my phone, the recording had captured something. My hands were shaking as I watched it. For the first hour, the video showed nothing but the inside of my car. Then the driver's door suddenly opened. A man climbed into the seat. It was Ron. He closed the door behind him and sat there in silence for almost a full minute. Then he started searching through my glove compartment. After that, he reached under the seat. When his hand brushed against my phone, the screen lit up. Ron froze. For a moment, he just stared at the device. Then he quickly grabbed it and turned the camera toward his face. The video ended right there. The next day, I didn't go to work. Instead, I went straight to the police station with the video and the map. An officer watched the footage twice before asking if I had any problems with my coworkers. I told him everything. About Derek's questions, about the note, about seeing Ron inside my car. The police contacted the warehouse management and started an investigation. Within a week, both Ron and Derek were fired. It turned out Ron had previously been arrested for stalking someone years earlier, but the situation got even stranger after that. When officers searched Ron's apartment, they found dozens of printed maps. Each one showed different houses around the city. Some of them had notes written on them. Others had photographs attached. My house wasn't the only one, but it was definitely one of them. To this day, I still don't know why he chose me. And sometimes when I get into my car late at night, I still catch myself checking the back seat first, just in case. The first thing I noticed about my great-aunt's house was how quiet it was at night. Not the peaceful kind of quiet you get in the countryside. The kind that feels like the entire place is holding its breath. I was 15 when my parents sent me to stay with my great-aunt for a few weeks. Their divorce had gotten messy, and the constant arguments at home were getting worse every day. My mom decided it would be best if I stayed somewhere else until things cooled down. So I ended up in a small town in upstate Vermont, living in a building that looked like it belonged in a horror movie. The house itself was massive, an old Victorian structure that had been converted into apartments decades earlier. My great-aunt owned the entire building. She lived on the first floor, while the second and third floors were rented out to tenants. At least, that's what I was told. When I first arrived, the place actually looked beautiful. High ceilings, creaky wooden floors, tall windows, and intricate wood carvings around every doorway. It had that old-fashioned charm you see in historic homes. But almost immediately, I noticed something strange about my aunt's behavior. Her name was Lucy, and she was polite enough, but she seemed unusually tense about certain parts of the house. For example, she had a huge master bedroom at the back of her apartment. The room had tall windows, antique furniture, and easily the most comfortable-looking bed in the entire building. But she didn't sleep there. Instead, she slept on a small fold-out bed in a cramped den next to the living room. When I asked her why she didn't use the main bedroom, she barely looked up from her newspaper and said it got too much sunlight in the morning. That explanation didn't make much sense to me, but I didn't question it. Back then, arguing with older relatives wasn't exactly encouraged. The first few nights were normal. I spent most of my time watching TV or reading while my aunt worked on puzzles or quietly read books in the living room. The town itself was small and boring, so there wasn't much else to do. Then, about 4 nights into my stay, I started hearing footsteps. They were coming from the apartment directly above us. At first, it didn't seem unusual. After all, someone probably lived up there. But the pattern of the footsteps was strange. Every night, right around midnight, the same sound would start. Slow pacing, back and forth, from one end of the apartment to the other. The person upstairs would walk in a straight line across the floor, pause for a moment, then walk back the same direction, over and over again. The strange thing was how methodical it sounded. It didn't sound like someone casually moving around their apartment. It sounded like someone measuring the distance between 2 walls. After hearing it for 3 nights in a row, I finally mentioned it to my aunt during breakfast. The reaction I got wasn't what I expected. She froze. Not dramatically, but just enough that I noticed. Then she calmly asked me what I meant. I told her about the footsteps upstairs. Her face tightened slightly. Then she said something that didn't make sense. The second-floor apartment is empty. I thought she misunderstood me, so I explained that someone was clearly walking around up there every night. But she shook her head. No one lives there right now. Then she added something even stranger. Old houses make noises. That was the end of the conversation. She changed the subject and refused to bring it up again. But the footsteps didn't stop. If anything, they became more noticeable once I started paying attention. Every night, right around midnight, the pacing began again, back and forth, back and forth. The sound lasted for hours. After about a week, curiosity got the better of me. I asked my aunt if I could see the empty apartment upstairs. She seemed hesitant at first, but after I kept asking, she finally grabbed a key from a drawer and led me upstairs. The second floor apartment looked exactly like she described. Completely empty. No furniture, no personal belongings, just bare hardwood floors and dusty windows. But as we walked through the rooms, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The floor in the living room had scuff marks, fresh ones. They formed a clear path across the wood, from one wall straight to the opposite wall, exactly the distance someone would walk if they were pacing back and forth. When I pointed this out, my aunt dismissed it immediately. She said the previous tenants probably left the marks, but the lines looked new, like someone had been walking the same route repeatedly. That night, the footsteps started again, louder than before. I looked over at my aunt while we were watching television. She didn't react at all. Instead, she quietly reached for the remote and turned up the volume, like she didn't want to hear it. That moment made something very clear. She knew about the footsteps. She just didn't want to talk about them. A few days later, I called my mom and told her everything. I expected her to laugh it off or say I was imagining things. Instead, she went silent for a moment. Then she told me something that confused me even more. "Don't ask your aunt about that." I asked her why. She said it was a sensitive subject. And that was it. She refused to explain anything else. That conversation made the situation feel even worse. It meant the adults in my family knew something they weren't telling me. One night, near the end of my visit, something happened that I still think about to this day. I woke up around 2 in the morning to use the bathroom. The apartment was dark and quiet as I walked down the hallway. But when I passed the staircase leading to the second floor, I noticed something strange. The door at the bottom of the stairs was slightly open. I was sure it had been closed earlier. As I stood there staring at it, I noticed a faint light coming from upstairs. It wasn't bright, just a small moving beam, like someone walking around with a flashlight. My heart started pounding. I stood there for a few seconds, frozen in place. Then I slowly pushed the door open. The light upstairs immediately stopped moving. The entire house went silent. I didn't go up there. Instead, I quietly closed the door and went straight back to bed. The next morning, I didn't say a word to my aunt, and she didn't ask. A few days later, my mom picked me up and I went back home. For years, no one in my family would talk about that house. Then, when I was in my 20s, I learned something interesting from a cousin. Apparently, sometime in the 1990s, there had been an incident in the building. Someone who lived in the second floor apartment had died there under strange circumstances. The details were never shared publicly, and shortly after that, my aunt inherited the property. Eventually, she sold the building and moved to Florida. I never got the full story. Maybe there was a logical explanation for the footsteps. Maybe someone had been secretly living upstairs, or maybe my aunt had been hiding someone who needed a place to stay. But there's one thing I can't explain. If the apartment was empty, then who was pacing across that floor every single night? If you enjoyed these stories, leave a like, subscribe for more true horror stories, and tell me in the comments which story disturbed you the most tonight.